Welcome to the Recovery Cast, brought to you by Hills and Rangers Private.
Hello again. Welcome back to another episode of the Recovery Cast, brought to you by Hills and Rangers Private. My name is Oliver and I'm a recovering addict. Today we are up to October the 22nd in the JFT, and that is entitled, Look Who's Talking. Our disease is so cunning that it can get us into impossible situations. Basic text, page 83. Some of us say, my disease is talking to me. Others say, my head won't turn off. Still, others refer to the committee in my mind or the monkey on my back. Let's face it, we suffer from an incurable malady that continues to affect us even in recovery. Our disease gives us warped information about what's going on in our lives. It tells us not to look at ourselves because what we'll see is too scary. Sometimes it tells us that we're not responsible for ourselves and our actions. Other times it tells us that everything wrong with the world is our fault. Our disease tricks us into trusting it. The NA program provides us with many voices that counter our addiction, voices we can trust. We can call our sponsor for a reality check. We can listen to the voice of an addict trying to get clean. The ultimate solution is to work the steps and draw on the strength of a higher power. That will get us through those times when our disease is talking. Just for today, I will ignore the voice of my addiction. I will listen to the voice of my program and a power greater than myself. What a beautiful reading. I can certainly relate that I'm suffering from what appears to be an incurable malady that affects me in my recovery, even when I'm in my recovery. That's why I had to do something different, and I found a solution in the 12 steps. I can also agree with addiction, or just my condition and my suffering, was that my viewpoint and my mind was just so warped that I didn't really see what was actually going on in my life. It was so warped, in fact, that I didn't really look at myself. As it says in the reading, it tells us not to look at ourselves because what we'll see is too scary. It's a really fancy way to say that for me. Well, I was absolutely in denial. I can definitely relate to not feeling responsible for myself and my actions. I held no responsibility. And it was always everybody else's fault. And then that would quickly jump to everything wrong with the world is my fault. And I just was so confused by the end that I didn't know really what was true and what was fantasy, what was delusion and denial. How do I know what the voice of my addiction is and what the voice of, as mentioned in the reading today, what the voice of my higher power is, what the voice of my sponsor is, what the voice of someone who's sharing in a meeting, who's speaking their experience? I generally have to sit on what I'm hearing and what I'm feeling and believing, and usually I can pretty quickly tell what the voice of my addiction is. because the voice of my addiction is to make me be dishonest and make me greedy and make me manipulative, resentful, mistrusting, fearful, all of those things that are really the opposite to the spiritual principles of the 12-step program, which is honesty, open-mindedness, willingness. When I'm acting on my disease or on my addiction, whatever you like to call it, I can tell, I know, and I get a little bit of a bad feeling deep within my body when I'm acting on the voice of my higher power. When I'm working like that, then I feel good. There's no other way to put it. It feels natural. It feels right. When I'm acting on anger, resentment, manipulative behavior, then I feel slightly uneasy deep down inside my stomach. And it's certainly very difficult to avoid acting that way at the beginning for me. I was always still acting out on old behaviors, even though I was still in recovery. I wasn't using. I was still being manipulative and selfish. And part of the way that I learned to listen a little bit more to what my personal higher power was wanting me to do or suggesting was that I listened to other people who were dealing with the same thing. I listened to other people in recovery at meetings sharing, and I got a sponsor and listened to what my sponsor had to say. And I've had a few sponsors over the years. They've all been people, I've picked them because they've all been people that I can call and I can bounce ideas off and say, hey, this just happened. I'm thinking of reacting to it in this way. And they'll say, oh, no, you don't. Absolutely not. Don't do that. That's a bad idea. I did that and it ended in disaster. Or I would suggest that you do this. And then once I think about it, I know that they've given me the right answer because it just seems right. It's always going to be an answer that involves me acting on love and open-mindedness, willingness, and honesty. And when I act on that, my life becomes less traumatic. There's no turbulence in it. It just cruises along nice and smooth, and I feel really good. Along the lines of what we were talking about, it tells us not to look at ourselves. It's a great time to start talking about the fifth step. We've talked about steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 in previous episodes. We're going to talk about the fifth step after this break and what that actually was like for me practicing the fifth step. Amazing. Stand by.
You're listening to the Recovery Cast, brought to you by Hills and Rangers Private. Like what you hear? Then visit us at www.rehab.melbourne for more shows.
That's right. You're listening to the Recovery Cast, brought to you by Hills and Rangers Private. You're with Oliver, and we are about to start talking about Step 5. So, for those of you who may not know what Step 5 actually is, it is we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Let me set the scene. I've just finished my fourth step. I've written down all the people that I had a resentment against, and I'm looking at it and seeing my part in things, working with my sponsor to say, well, the reason that I have all these resentments and I've had all these run-ins with different people throughout the course of my life is just because I'm actually I've actually been running. I was actually running on my disease for years and years, even before I stopped, even before I started using in the first place. And all my motives and all my actions were governed by that disease and that sense of needing to control everything and being totally fearful of abandonment, judgment, rejection. I was trying to protect myself in the only way that I knew how, and that was just through really unhealthy, super unhealthy motives, and really just fearful. I was just afraid. I hadn't really developed. I'd been using for a long time in my life, and that spiritual growth just wasn't happening. So through the act of sharing my step 4, I'm sharing the exact nature of my wrongs. And I shared my resentments and all the defects that I had with another human being, which was my sponsor. I shared it with myself because when I started doing step 4, I actually didn't even know that I was controlling. I thought I was absolutely open-minded and generous and compassionate. That is the nature of how my addiction just clouded my mind and made me quite insane. And I admitted it to God. You know, they say God, it's just something, it's a higher power, whatever. Doesn't have to be anything. It was just me, you know, sitting in the car by myself saying, God, please help me and help me deal with this addiction that I'm suffering from. Help me recover. Every birthday I've had, every actual birthday I've had in recovery, when I blow out candles, every time I see a shooting star, every time I need to make a wish, I just wish that I stay clean and stay in recovery. That's how willing I am. And when I admitted to God that, you know, I was controlling and fearful, it started to set the scene for step 6 and 7, which are, we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And step 7, we humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. It's almost like 5, 6, and 7 are just an extension of step 1, 2, and 3. Because when I admit to God the exact nature of my wrongs, I admit that I have all these defects. That's like admitting that I'm powerless over my addiction and that my life was unmanageable. Step 6 is we became ready and we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. That's like believing in a higher power greater than ourselves that can restore us to sanity. I had to pray and learn to believe that, well, I can actually have all these defects removed. I can actually have my fear and control removed, and I can live with an open-minded freeness and liberation of that fear and control that I used to suffer from. And then step 7 is we humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. It's just an extension of step 3, saying that I can turn my will over to a higher power and let that higher power guide me. Every experience I've had through working the steps is just one of trying to make my life simpler and make my experience a little bit less clouded with addiction and a little bit less clouded with confusion, fear, and controlling actions. When I shared my defects, I've mentioned before that a problem shared is a problem halved. I shared it with God, with myself, and with another human being, and it's like cutting it in half and in half and in half again. The enormity of my situation and the fact that I'd destroyed my life with addiction was lessened. It felt like the burden was starting to be lifted. And I've heard that many times in meetings and from people in recovery who are working the steps, is that it starts to get easier. And that real raw emotional nature and the anger that I felt when I was in early recovery started to lessen. It was beginning to transition me from that early recovery stage to what I wanted to arrive at, which was what I saw in meetings when I went. I saw people that were living really great lives and laughing and carrying on and just seeming pretty normal, except for the fact that when they'd share, they'd talk of that struggle that they went through and how they got through it. It really is an experience where I was helped and loved back to life from being very, very alone and being very afraid, angry, incredibly, incredibly angry, that I began to unpack all that stuff. And I couldn't do that in therapy, just me personally. Having a therapist sit there and listen to me talk, it just brought up all this emotion, and I left feeling worse than when I arrived. And when I do this actual work, this step work, these answering questions and writing and sharing with my sponsor and in meetings, it seemed to lessen the burden for me in a way that I had never ever experienced before. And that's why I'm still doing this stuff, nearly 4 years on of attending meetings and being in recovery, is because that process, and step 5 particularly, was the beginning and just me starting to get well. I'm so grateful for this experience, and I'll share with you now. Obviously, I make these episodes a little bit ahead of time, but tomorrow I'm about to turn 4 years clean. And I would never have gotten there if it wasn't for the steps. I'm not telling anybody on here what to do. I'm not telling my listeners what to do, and I'm not preaching. I'm telling you, I'm sharing my experience, and I encourage everybody who's listening to think about what they're going to do today for their recovery. Even if it's just one thing, one little thing. Perhaps it's call your sponsor if you have one. Maybe start putting the feelers out to get a sponsor if you don't have one. Maybe it's jump on an online meeting. Read the basic text of whatever your preferred 12-step fellowship is. And then do something for self-care. Do something you enjoy. Recovery doesn't have to be boring, and it doesn't have to be difficult. My experience is that recovery is an absolute joy, and that I'm living a life that's beyond my wildest dreams. I hear lots of people sharing that exact same experience, and it's not just for people, other people, it can be for you too. Isn't that just magical? So I hope you get to experience that, and if you're not already, then do something about it. Speak to someone, reach out, keep reaching out, and keep trying something different, because there is relief. It does happen. It can happen for you. Thanks again. You've been listening to Oliver, and this has been the Recovery Cast, brought to you by Hills and Ranges Private. I look forward to sharing more with you next time. Have a lovely day.
Thank you for listening to the Recovery Cast. For more, visit us at www.rehab.melbourne.